Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world today. Welcome to the 36th annual Bread and Roses Labor Day Heritage Festival. My name is Hartley Plushaw. I will be one of your guides to this event. And this is our 36th festival, but it is the first virtual one. If I can quote the great broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow when he started his first television program, this is an old team playing a new game. Well, like everyone else in the year 2020, we've had to make some changes and some adjustments. Unfortunately, the bad news is we're not in the usual lovely Campione Common in Lawrence, Massachusetts, out in the open, out in the fresh air and the sunshine to present our festival today. The good news is that we are now, for the first time ever, able to bring this festival all over the world, courtesy of the well-named World Wide Web. So wherever you are in the world today, welcome. And I would like to particularly welcome you to this segment of the festival called Lawrence History Live. It is a segment of the festival in which we have been blessed through the years with a great many creative people, authors, journalists, artists, activists, historians, talking about the various ways in which the great Lawrence Textile Workers Strike of 1912 resonates to this day in our world. And even though that strike took place 108 years ago, it's hard to pick up a newspaper or turn on a television set and not realize that so many of the issues and concerns of that strike back then are totally relevant to the world today. Once again, as in 1912, people are taking to the streets demanding justice. And so many of the issues that were dealt with in the Lawrence strike of 1912, immigration, the treatment of working people, the treatment of minorities, social and economic equality, and women's rights resonate to this very day in both their relevance and importance. And to that end, we are most happy to be joined by three people who are responsible for creating a very significant and important documentary film about the struggles of women in our society, specifically an event that took place 49 years ago in the Boston area. There was the beginning of the next phase, the modern phase of the feminist movement. And it just so happened that the feminist collective in Boston in those days was known as Bread and Roses. Yes, that phrase has taken on a meaning of its own through the decades and now into a new century. But the women who seized the mantle of modern feminism in Boston back in the late 1960s and early 1970s chose that phrase to name their organization. And one of the most significant events of that time was depicted and is depicted in this remarkable documentary film. Three of the makers of that film will be joining us very soon, but first let me tell you who they are. Susie Rivo, the producer and director of the film, Left on Pearl, has an MFA in cinema production from San Francisco State University. Her award-winning short film, Amy, screened at Sundance and other film festivals and was broadcast on PBS stations. She is a resident scholar at the Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center. Libby Bouvier, whom I hope will be joining us soon, has been involved with the Cambridge Women's Center since 1972. Libby is the director of the Massachusetts Division of Archives and Records for the state court system. She's an executive producer of Left on Pearl, Women Take Over 888 Memorial Drive, Cambridge, and a longtime volunteer and board member of the History Project, documenting Boston's LGBTQ history. And Rochelle Ruthchild, is a center associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Harvard University, a resident scholar at the Brandeis University Women's Studies Research Center, an executive producer of the documentary film Left on Pearl, and the author of Equality and Revolution, Women's Rights in the Russian Empire, 1905-1917. She was involved with the socialist feminist organization Bread and Roses in the early 1970s, took part in the takeover of 888 Memorial Drive depicted in Left on Pearl, and was active at the Cambridge Women's Center from its beginnings. So one last thing before I turn you over to Susie, Libby, and Rochelle. If you have questions, please send them to us. You will notice the Q&A thing at the bottom of your screen. Click on it, write your questions, and at the end of the lecture, I will relay those questions to our panelists. So, no further ado, I am most honored to introduce as the first program of Lawrence History Live of this year's Bread and Roses Labor Day Heritage Festival, Susie Rivo, Libby Bouvier, and Rochelle Ruthchild.
Thank you so much for having us.
You are most welcome.
So I think first we're going to play our short trailer. It's like 2 minutes. And you can get a sense of what the film is about. There should be sound.
Sorry, was there not sound?
Yeah, there's no sound and it's, yeah.
Okay.
It's frozen.
Sorry, I stopped it. That's why it's frozen.
No, okay. No worries. Okay.
I will try it again and make sure. Oh, okay. This should work this time. Sorry about that.
No problem.
If you want to just give a thumbs up once I start it, if there is sound.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It was a wonderful, brave act.
It was a watershed.
It was an illegal act.
March 6, 1971. Boston area women occupied 888 Memorial Drive, a former knitting factory owned by Harvard University, and proclaimed it a women's center.
Harvard had this big building, huge resource. We had no place to put a women's center. It seemed like the place to do it.
I remembered the fear of being photographed and the fear of using your real name.
Some people were afraid that I was a plant by the feds.
There was so much energy.
This great pleasures of being with women, dancing with women. But now people are taking it to a new level, sleeping with women.
Oh, so you don't have the guts to be a lesbian.
We have already begun to provide childcare, a health class, a karate class, an auto mechanics class, carpentry.
The police are going to assault the building.
We had incredible power.
We were making history.
People think they're not powerful. They are powerful. Only if you come together.
Thank you. That went well. It's a little bit like pixelated because of the streaming, but it's fine. So Left on Pearl is a documentary. It's almost an hour long, and it was finished in 2017 and has been playing at festivals around the world since then. We're in the process of setting up distribution. more broadly for institutions, educational institutions, etc. And Rochelle Ruthchild here is the executive, one of the 4 executive producers. They started working on this in, I think, 1999 or 2000, and then brought me in 2003, and I brought in Iftach Shavit, who is a fabulous editor, and Lynn Weissman, who's a great videographer, and we went from there. We interviewed about 50 women and men, at least, who were involved in the story that we tell here. And basically, this is about second wave feminism, which is called second wave because the first wave was all of this labor activism and suffrage activism to get the right to vote. So historians call the 60s and 70s feminism that reemerged in a new form second wave feminism, and it was also called the women's liberation movement. So we have a presentation here. I don't know if you can still see it.
You'll have to click share screen again, Susie.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, this is the
Sure.
voice from the ether speaking.
No problem. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm not seeing it, but are you seeing it, folks?
No,
Okay.
I should say while Susie is working on that, you can see the t-shirt that we made, which is available through our website. If you want to have more information about the film, it's www.leftonpearl.org.
Can you put it up for me?
Yes.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so this is how it kind of started. A lot of the women in the women's movement were starting to form small groups. Rochelle, please jump in at any point.
Sure.
And a lot of them had come out of the civil rights movement and had gone down south to help with, trying to register. Came out of the anti-war movement and were still involved in those same things. They weren't really separate, but they started to recognize how they were treated as second-class citizens within those movements, as well as in society in general. So they started forming these consciousness-raising groups, and the organization Bread and Roses was consciously named after the 1912 strike. Rochelle?
Yeah, so I actually came to Boston in 1969. I came a little bit later after this conference at Emmanuel College. And one of the things that also came out of that conference was the collective, the Women's Health Book Collective, Our Bodies Ourselves, which is one of the hallmark publications of second wave feminism, which has been translated into many, many languages and has had worldwide distribution.
So the birth of Bread and Roses here kind of came out of that conference, and you can see that they deliberately connected with the previous wave of feminism and Bread and Roses, naming themselves Bread and Roses. And we have just some, visuals from that time. There were all sorts of activities all over the Boston area and also in other cities. The Bread and Roses folks would go to other demonstrations, against the war and supporting the Black Panthers and just all sorts of political activism with a feminist kind of seeing it through a feminist lens.
And it was a time of great social ferment. As Susie has mentioned, the very strong anti-war movement, community activism around civil rights, around the police actions, police brutality at that time. So there were many, many kinds of demonstration student strikes at that period.
You can go to the next. Yeah, and women were also learning karate and other forms of self-defense. Rochelle was involved in that too. Do you want to talk
Yeah,
about
no, I mean, it was a time when we thought we could do everything and change. There was a lot of idealism and the belief that the society was ready for major change and that we could take a very active role in spearheading that change. And in addition, there was this idea that we could learn to defend ourselves and really kind of challenge the socialization of women as helpless creatures. So there were a lot of various strands to the women's movement at that time, and self-defense was a big part of it.
next slide? So let's see. Yeah, so women's liberation, you know, as I mentioned, supported, strands of it supported the Black Panthers on trial in New Haven, and also the Constitution, the People's Constitutional Convention that was called by the Black Panthers and invited the women's movement as well as the gay rights movement to join them. So there was a lot of back and forth here, and you can see it. You can see it in some of the Bread and Roses newsletters, discussion of going to this conference in Philadelphia that the Black Panthers called.
There's something, I mean, now it's very hip to talk about intersectionality. That is the ways in which various social movements interact with each other around class and race and sexual orientation. But this is not a new phenomenon. And Susie's slides really show the way in which the women's liberation movement at that time was very conscious and reaching out to and supportive of other movements of the time, particularly Black liberation.
Yeah, this is really funny. Do you want to talk about the Oglen, Rochelle?
Well, that was one of the things, just in terms of reclaiming public space. As a woman, particularly a young woman, walking the streets of any major city, it was not uncommon to be hassled with catcalls and comments, smile. We were supposed to be smiling all the time. And Bread and Roses organized a kind of reaction to that where we did the catcalling, just to point out how, what it meant and how the streets really need to take back the streets, basically. Take back public space.
We show that in our film as well.
And for people who say that feminists have no sense of humor, I think some of these actions that we took show that indeed we had a very vibrant sense of humor.
This is just really interesting because Florence Luscombe, who you see in both pictures here on the left and on the right, she's a person who was involved in both waves of feminism. She grew up, her mother was a suffragist, and she was active from childhood. And you can see her selling the Woman's Journal here. And she stayed politically active her whole life in lots of different movements on the left. And then when feminism kind of restarted in the late 60s, she was right there and involved, and you can see her at a demonstration in Boston in 1970. So the two movements are not so unlinked. I mean, they're not so far apart. Now, here's another action Rochelle took part in.
This was our Chicks action, because it was in protest against WBCN, Charles Laquadere in particular, who made an announcement saying that a local organization needed volunteers. And if you're a chick and can type, they want you. And so we did an action to point out that there are baby chicks, which we brought to the station, and then there are real live women, and we are not chicks.
This is another major, I believe, was this the Cambodia, like post-Kent State and invasion of Cambodia? The
Yeah.
May 8th. Yeah, it was a huge demonstration at Soldiers Field, and Bread and Roses spoke. And I'm not quite sure why they have masks on their faces, but they did a lot of theatrical things.
As
Sorry.
Hartley pointed out, we were in the vanguard even on masks.
Okay, so now let's just pause here for a moment because this is important. In 1970, I believe it was June, Sandra Graham and members of the Riverside Cambridge community took over the stage at Harvard's commencement and demanded that Harvard negotiate with them over their, being displaced from their own neighborhood by Harvard's expansion. And they were asking for some housing to be replaced that Harvard had taken. And also just the fact that rents were going way up because of Harvard's, gentrification and expansion in the area. Harvard is actually one of the, if not the biggest landowners in Cambridge. So there was a lot of action around that. So our film also covers this, and there is an intersection between this movement and our film. I'm sorry, the activities that our film depicts of the building takeover in 1971 by women happened to be in that neighborhood, and so there was some joint efforts related to that. Rochelle, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I mean, I think this shows history in history. This, the takeover of the Harvard graduation in 1970 is not something that you find in the official histories of Harvard. It's pretty much been disappeared. So one of the reasons that we made our film actually was to make visible the history that normally isn't in establishment histories, made prominent or recorded at all.
Yeah, so as a result of that action at WBCN, there were some results from that.
Yeah, we demanded an hour of airtime. We did also demand that they hire women DJs, which they ultimately did do, and we did get an hour of airtime.
Okay, now this was at the Boston Globe. Women also did a similar thing at the Globe. Do you want to explain that?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same thing. It was recognizing that the media at the time was not paying attention to women's issues or trivializing issues around women and women's equality. And the demand there was to stop segregating the help wanted sections, which were divided at that point into male and female. And when we talk about that today, when we present the film, people are just astounded. But this was another outcome of women's liberation protests.
So this was I believe, the first International Women's Day march in the sort of new era of feminism. International Women's Day, another one of Rochelle's specialties in her research, had been celebrated. It actually started in this country, but had sort of gone dormant for decades. And the New Women's Movement revitalized it.
But I think this is another connection with the first Bread and Roses strike, which was that International Women's Day really started in part because of labor actions in the United States and the way in which women workers were very active in those labor actions. And the holiday started in 1910, and its chief demand was women's suffrage. But it wasn't, as Susie said, it wasn't celebrated. It hasn't been celebrated much in the United States, but it is a big holiday in much of the world.
So Our Bodies Ourselves book, you may have heard of. It's very, very famous. One of the most lasting achievements of this era, representing, I don't know how we are doing on time. Please let me know if we're going way over. But anyway, Women from Bread and Roses were responsible for starting that. There were a lot of different collectives and small groups of women trying to sort of reclaim their bodies from the medical establishment, which was very paternalistic and condescending, and didn't treat women as full human beings.
Okay, we have 4 more minutes.
Okay. All right, so here we go. This is the flyer for the 1971 March. And you can go kind of, so then this is the trail of abuses, as they called it. The places they stopped on the march. And
this is important though. I mean, if you look at these demands, you see that every single one of those demands is still not achieved.
Right. And then here we specifically link, the earlier wave of feminism. And this is from the march. And this is in Cambridge, right near the building that was taken over. And here we go. The women had planned to take over a building in advance, and it was a secret plan. And there were some women who worked on that, and others who worked on the march. And then when the march arrived at the building, they were let in, and there were hundreds of women in that building, which was 888 Memorial Drive, a building owned by Harvard. The women organized this new, what they called the New Women's Center, and liberated building they had liberated. And they did all kinds of activities there. They actually thought they'd be kicked out immediately, but they ended up staying for 10 days. And once they set things up, they invited other women in, and a whole lot of women came over the course of 10 days to dances and to check it out and for childcare. And they got tons of donations of food. People came in to help out with all sorts of things. They reached out to the neighborhood and had parties for neighborhood kids.
And joined in the demand for affordable housing on that site, the site on which 888 Memorial Drive was located.
Yeah, that was actually the exact site that the neighborhood had been demanding for years, because it was the last open area on the river that hadn't been developed yet. There was still this old building, 888 Memorial Drive, that Harvard only used part-time for some workshops. But it was planned, Harvard had planned to put student housing there, and the community didn't want that. They wanted housing for the, affordable housing to replace some of the units that they had been losing over the years. So this went up like 10 years ago, maybe?
Yeah.
I don't know, lost track of time, but this is right on Memorial Drive. Cambridge Historical Commission put up this sign to recognize the past, to recognize the work of feminists. I don't know how many other cities in the world would do something like this. It's pretty cool.
So the end result of the march in terms of ultimate achievements were that there has been some affordable housing built both around the site of 888 Memorial Drive and also nearby on Memorial Drive. There is the Cambridge Women's Center, which has been in existence since 1972 and is the longest continuously operating women's center in the world, probably, community women's center in the world. So those are some of the achievements that resulted or emerged from the takeover. Once again, our website is www.leftonpearl.org. You can find out more. You can see the trailer again on the site, find out more about what we've done, where we've been, where we've shown the film. And also, if you want, you can get t-shirts, like the t-shirts that Susie and I are wearing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today at the Bread and Roses Festival. I want to apologize. During my introduction, I failed to note that the very theme of this year's festival is 100 years of women changing the current. We're noting the 100th anniversary of women obtaining the right to vote in the United States this year. And of course, women's issues continue to be at the top of the agenda of our lives these days. So, and now we know even more about how the phrase bread and roses is so important and so inspirational to so many people. So Susie, Rochelle, I guess we're kind of out of time here, but thank you. And Libby, I'm sorry she couldn't join us today, but thank you both for joining us today. Congratulations on your remarkable film. And you know, we will always be in your debt and the debt of all those other women who carried on these struggles for decency, for dignity, for equality, which are all very much in line with what we celebrate in Lawrence today. So thank you both very much.
Thank you for having us.
I'm just going to jump in and say if the panelists want to stick around, folks can type questions into the Q&A, and you should be able to answer them by typing if you would like to.